Bueno, muchas gracias a Gate por organizar este evento, and thank you very much, Simon, for being here. It's a pleasure, and your collaboration with Gate. As Beatriz said, Gate is a think tank doing global analysis. We don't do Spanish economy or Spanish Spain's analysis, not even European, but global analysis. And of course, we are looking for a think tank that promotes dialogue and cooperation and multilateralism and so on. So this book for us is perfect because it offers a global view of a very interesting question, and it allows us to exchange ideas. And your point is that these institutional factors, which are summarized in these very interesting links between these business groups and the political power, is going to hurt at some point of time, is going to hurt both innovation and productivity growth, no? Which is, in a sense, is a very relevant question. No? Now, as I told you sometime, this brings me the idea of a person that goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have to go on a diet because you need to take care of your health. Otherwise, it's going to be bad for you. And the guy doesn't pay attention to the doctor and says, well, I'm going to have breakfast with donuts. I'm going to drink wine whenever I want. I'm going to eat pizza. But then the guy goes to have a blood test, the analytics, and the analytics are excellent. And then the guy says, and the doctor says, what's going on here? This guy is not following my recommendation regarding institutions, but growth is very strong in Asia. Now, your point is, wait and see. Wait and see. You're doing very well because you're young and everything is good for you, but wait till you get older. And this is going to, of course, going to have an effect on your health, in this case, on your growth. No? Now, I am a little bit skeptical about this wait and see. Why? Because the per capita income of Asia is so low, most of the countries, I mean the big countries, India, China, and so on, is so low that the convergence process is going to make this growth to be unstoppable. No? Maybe there will be not convergence in real per capita income, but in terms of GDP, there is no question that they will surpass the Western economy. They're almost doing it already, and that China will surpass the U.S. in the next decade or so. No? And the second point is, to what extent are we sure that these institutions are so relevant in terms of productivity and innovation? They're probably very relevant in terms of quality of life, democracy, human rights. That I don't question. But in terms of productivity and economic growth, I really am not sure about this importance of these institutions. And in that sense, there is something that I would like to debate with you first. One temporary question, and then a cross-section. The time series question is, okay, maybe Asia is just 50 or even 100 years behind the US or the Western Europe economies. No? In what sense? That the US and Western European economies, they also had this type of big business conglomerates, business groups with a lot of links with the political power. For example, well, it's not that I'm enjoying Succession in HBO, but for example, we know that the Rockefellers, the Ford, Hearst, and so on, the Carnegie families, they have a strong links in the early 20th century with the political power. And they have also this dynasty type of structure, and they impose some type of barriers to entry, but yet the US did fine. And they grew a lot, the US economy grew a lot, and they innovated. And then why cannot this happen also in Asia? Aren't we just watching what happened in the US but 100 years later? That's one question. And the other question is, if we do cross-section, so the same point of time now of Asia with other regions of the world, are we really in Asia that bad compared in the institutional arrangements compared with, for example, Latin America, or not to say Africa? Probably Asia is doing much better, right? And actually, I found this index, so-called Elite Quality Index, the University of St. Gallen, that they did a ranking of countries' elites, because here the problem is not the elite and the general population. The question here is a good elite or bad elite. And these guys did a ranking of elite quality, and surprising, a lot of countries in the first 30 positions are from Asia. Singapore is number 1, Japan 18, South Korea 19, China 27, Thailand 30, and for example, Spain is 34. Italy is 40. So they are better in this elite ranking even than countries like Spain, Italy, Chile, or other countries that supposedly have very good or much better institutions. So my point here is, why do we think, or are we sure, positive, that this is going to be so binding as to claim that the 21st century is not going to belong to Asia?
Okay. Well, firstly, thanks to Beatriz, Gates Center, for inviting me and for our conversation debate. And I can see that although you may be lame physically after your operation, you're obviously not lame mentally. And that's the most important thing, because the points you raise are excellent and provocative. Perhaps I could just say a few things about the central arguments of the book, or restate them, and then bring them back to what you say, Miguel, so nicely. The book essentially argues that Asia is the great success of modern times. That's obvious to all. And as you rightly point out, it's got Asia to a point where, say, Chinese per capita incomes are a bit less than 20% of the US. South Korea is about half. India is in single digits, way down in single digits. So there's a lot of convergence, but convergence doesn't happen automatically. It's not a thing that you just get going and it takes off at whatever pace. It depends on a whole bunch of things. And in our book, what we argue is that the arrangements, institutional and the like, that have been formed have been highly useful, indeed highly productive, for, as it were, the stage of development, to borrow Rostow's phrase, that Asia has been going through. In other words, the accumulation of capital, human, physical, and the like, and the so-called, as we economists call it, extensive growth that has driven Asia onwards right now. But in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, in China, in Malaysia, in Thailand to some extent, this model is sort of run out of steam. You simply can't throw more capital at the problem. In fact, the Chinese probably have thrown far too much capital at the problem with declining returns. And in other places, essentially the labor force is finite. You can't simply rely on large transfers of people from the countryside to the town to drive it. So willy-nilly, as we say in English, these economies are going to have to shift towards innovation. And innovation can take many forms. And what we argue, and by the way, we're not saying that the institutional framework that we find grosso modo in the West, whatever that is, because the West is very heterogeneous. The US is not the same as Britain indeed, or France, let alone Spain. So there's a lot of heterogeneity there. We're not saying just take the institutions of the West, but what we're saying is that the coming together of the state and powerful family-owned business groups in Asia, which has been the singular feature of all these economies, of all, Vietnam just as much as India or Thailand. This framework will not necessarily be supportive of innovation, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it stifles competition. Too much of the markets are controlled by too few players. And let me give you one very stark example, which comes from India. It's very interesting. The 15 largest, and they're almost all, by the way, family-owned business groups. So here we have Tatas, we have Birla, we have the Ambanis, we now have Mr. Adani in there. The 15 largest of these business groups, non-public sector, non-financial, controlled, their revenues amounted to roughly 9% of India's GDP in 2000. Right now, it's about 15 or 16%. That's an extraordinary rise. So in other words, these large companies are controlling an increasingly larger bit of economic territory. And that is true almost in the region, throughout the region. It's as true in Thailand as it is in Malaysia and the like. And what happens when you have that sort of ability to control territory, some of which comes because of excellent political connections? So Mr. Adani and his group is the most recent striking example. But that goes for Ambani as well and others. What happens? Well, some of them sit on their laurels and they don't innovate, they just take rents. Some of them innovate and actually innovate a lot. And some who are not business groups also innovate, like Raphael and I were talking earlier, Infosys and the tech and the pharma companies and the like. So you do get innovation, but it's from a very narrow group of companies and interests. And it does not create the overarching and rich ecology that will, I think, support innovation in the long run. And I don't want to go on for very long, I'll hand it back to you, but let me give you the example of perhaps the most successful economy that we cover in the book, which is South Korea. Now, South Korea is an extraordinary success. I mean, essentially, it's got some very powerful, very successful, internationally competitive companies, of which Samsung is probably the best known. Now, Samsung accounts for roughly 22% of South Korean GDP. It's very innovative, it's very dynamic. But the reality is in South Korea, and this is the preoccupation of policymakers there, there's not much that goes on outside of it. It's like a large banyan tree under which virtually nothing else thrives. So yes, innovative. And in that case, more so than elsewhere in Asia, precisely because it's so open to competition. But a lot of risk rolled up. So if you are in Korea's policymakers' shoes, they worry that so much risk is concentrated in so few players. So if they get the wrong bets, the implications for the economy are very large. So to cut to the quick, I feel that Asia will innovate, but it may not necessarily innovate to the extent that is feasible or desirable, and therefore it will underachieve. Whether it will underachieve relative to Latin America and Africa, it's clear that it will overachieve, but the barrier is not set very high, to be fair. In that instance, I see it. So really our book is about why we might want, or people interested in policy, to rethink this reliance on large, politically connected, family-run business groups. They have a place, but they shouldn't have the place that they have right now. And the consequences will be, I think, that Asia will underperform. And the last point that I want to make, which is really a very, very important one, and particularly in political economy terms, which is that these business groups have seen the most extraordinary concentration of wealth and indeed of income. Really extraordinary. The number of billionaires in China has gone from almost nothing in 2000 to in the hundreds. Similarly in India, a few in 2000. Some of the individual wealths are quite extraordinary. The Keiravanont family, Chinese Thai family, probably the owners of CP Group in Thailand, their consolidated wealth is north of $24–25 billion. And I really don't find, from looking at a long perspective, whether it's in Europe or in Latin America or in other countries, that you can get broad-based prosperity in the long run when you have these degrees of inequality. And I think this is, sad to say, one consequence of the system. So I don't know whether that's a good response to your points, but it is.
I think that in a sense, what is happening also is that maybe we try to judge the Asian institutions from the Western mentality. And I'm not sure how fair is that. For example, you mentioned industrial policy. Well, industrial policy maybe is, actually I think that at least the US and the European Union, there is a revision of the non-industrial policy paradigm of Gary Becker and so on. No? But I think that for them, industrial policy is fine and is not hurting. That doesn't hurt. That doesn't hurt the productivity or the growth model. No? Now the question is, how can we reconcile the fact that these groups, family groups, business groups, with the political ties, with the fact that, for example, China is the number one exporter in the world. Because if you are an exporter, it means that you are competitive and you are productive. No? Well, I can also talk about Korea, South Korea, and other countries. No? But these countries are exporting a lot. And that it's even more than the US, for example. No? So I think it's hard to reconcile this claim that they are not that productive or competitive, and that they are maybe too big in terms of the economic size, with this extraordinary performance of exports. So we are not only talking about GDP, we're talking about exports, the role in world trade, which is fantastic. You know? And now I agree with you that we have a problem of inequality, but not only in Asia. We have a problem of inequality everywhere, and in particular in the US, wealth concentration is, I would like to see a ranking on that, is as high as, or even higher than the cases you mentioned in Asia. No? And finally, technology. I read this report of our colleagues, the think tank Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, that says that they measure 44 technologies, and in 37 of these 44, China is ahead of the US, meaning the technological progress. No? You mentioned in the book that you don't like the way they measure patents, because the patents in Asia are not, in a sense, equivalent to the patents in the Western world. I would like maybe a word from you on that, because patents are patents, no matter how we measure them. No? And there are some, of course, some technologies like artificial intelligence, where clearly the Asian companies, particularly the Chinese companies, are well ahead of even the US. So I'm not sure that this asymptote, because your claim is that there is going to be an asymptote in the growth, no, of these countries, and maybe we are reaching this asymptote. I don't see any sign of asymptote, and I don't see I'm not convinced, even if I find your book very, very interesting and very provocative, any sign that we are getting close to that asymptote.
Okay. Well, let me come back at you on a couple of points. Firstly, the governance point. I mean, the book, it must be clear, we're not saying, oh, just adopt what's in the UK or the US. It really is definitely not that. And you're absolutely right. Many of the points are relevant to the US, where, for instance, in the title of the book, connections between politicians and business are far too close, far too cozy, and far too opaque in many cases. I mean, the ingenuity with which business has gone about making political contributions in the US is impressive, but not in a good way necessarily. So we're not saying that, but we are saying that, if you're a minority shareholder in a family-owned business in India or in Thailand or in Indonesia, you will probably come out at the wrong end of the bargain. And this is very, very clear. I mean, these structures are organized like pyramids in order to benefit the families who own them and to give them far more control than their ownership ought to confer. And they use it sometimes for good purposes and sometimes, as I would suggest, is being alleged for Adani, for purposes that are thoroughly undesirable, not least of all huge leveraging, debt, offshore games, all of this. So I think, when we're talking about better governance, there's a sort of almost a moral dimension to it, just as much as a political one. So on that, but I really don't want to come back that we're not saying go and just adopt, London's corporate governance code, not a bit of it. Now, by the way, it is true, of course, you mentioned Hearst and Ford and the like, but actually Roosevelt, of course, did enormous amounts of effort in the 30s to unbundle and basically dismantle the business group as a format in the US. And the conglomerates still exist, but by and large, American companies are not operating in tens of sectors, in huge numbers of activities. They really aren't. I mean, just to give you, I gave you some information about India, all of those groups. Let me tell you that most of those groups, believe it or not, have, tens, if not hundreds of subsidiaries and operate in upwards of 40, 50, 5-digit industries. They're in everything. They're highly diversified. And that's really weird because in Asia, just as much as in the US, actually their value on the stock exchange is normally depreciated when you do all of these sorts of things. But they're doing it, and they're doing it for a reason, because they derive benefits. And many of those benefits are to do with cross-finance within the group, but also connections to politics and the way they assemble their business empires. So that's on one. Trade, you're absolutely right. China, of course, has been, in a sense, trying to upgrade its trade. There's a lot of low-end stuff that they've been exporting. Now they're wanting to move into high-end. But where we think, and this joins up with technology, that China is particularly innovative, and these are essentially bringing together financial and other services, internet-based services together with products that are much more integrated, probably much more effective than their Western comparators. But these are for the domestic market, and they proceed behind protection, enormous amounts of protection, intellectual as well as trade protection. And lastly, on technology, you quote the Australian study. That study I thought was really weird, and it just tells you why one should be careful. They went about looking at citations and then came up with a normative list almost. So I don't really find the methodology convincing. And on patents, the point that we make in the book is a lot to do with China, because China is a patent machine. But the number of patents that are lodged and the number of patents that are granted, there's a massive disparity. And what it suggests is that many Chinese companies lodge patents because they will get credit in Beijing. because patenting is an explicit goal in the 5-year plan and the like. But actually very few of them get granted. And then when you go and you look at patents that are granted in China and also in a foreign jurisdiction, whether it be Frankfurt or in Washington or wherever, then the number falls dramatically lower. These are high-value patents, and they are with companies that you would expect them to be. So for Korea, it's largely Samsung and the like. But with China, the patent story has to be looked very carefully, and it's, I think, much more nuanced. So that's how I'd come back to you on those, Miguel.
Okay.